Chapter 17. A unique path. Take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. Colossians 4:17. There is a set path to your purpose. In the Bible, this path is called the wilderness, and it is specially tailored to each sojourner, depending on the magnitude of the call and the readiness of the individual. Everyone's wilderness preparation length is different because each person is unique. For instance, when Christ went through his wilderness testing, he spent just 40 days there fasting, and Satan tempted and tested Christ, but Christ was victorious on every front on the first attempt. But normal people aren't perfect like Christ. We were born with a sinful nature and have waded through a lifetime of spiritual muck, all the while carrying a load of worldly baggage from a life of corrupted existence. More often than not, we do not succeed in the wilderness tests flung at us the first time around. There are lifelong bad habits to overcome. There is a lifetime of wrong thinking to correct. For the Israelites, what could have been an 11-day wilderness journey to the Promised Land took them 40 years of arduous travel, oftentimes while going in circles around the same mountain. In a spiritual context, a seemingly immovable spiritual obstacle like lust, pride, anger, etc., again and again and again. Here is why they couldn't just go straight to the Promised Land. I'm sure you recall this passage from earlier. Then it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt. Exodus 13:17-18. In other words, the Israelites' faith was still immature and they weren't ready to handle the larger obstacles in their path, so they had to travel the long way around. They first had to be trained up to these later battles with smaller earlier battles. Eventually, they would fight the Philistines and be victorious, but not on that day. Likewise, much of the wilderness journey depends on the individual and their willingness to step out in faith when the preparatory battles did arrive. Of course, every Christian en route to his or her purpose will have to traverse the wilderness for a time, but the overall length of the journey, after a certain point, depends on the individual and not the Lord. When they left Egypt, instead of taking the 11-day route through the land of the Philistines, they took a longer route by the way of the Red Sea. God led them, provided for them, protected them, and even pushed them into various armed conflicts where the Israelites could obediently step out in faith and come through victorious. Numbers chapter 21 verses 3, 24, and 35. It took about 2 years for the Israelites to be prepared, from the time of the Egypt exodus up to the long-awaited instruction from the Lord to conquer the Promised Land. Numbers 13 verses 1-3. When the Israelites afterward rebelled and said they would not go up into the Promised Land, even after 2 years of extensive preparation, all because they feared the giants in the land more than they trusted God. Numbers 14 verses 1-4. Here is what the Lord said to Moses when they refused. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people reject me, and how long will they not believe me, with all the signs which I have performed among them? Numbers 14 verse 11. God had done his part, but most of the people, even though they were sufficiently readied, still refused to fully trust in him, to believe that the all-knowing, all-powerful God knew better what he was doing in their lives than they did. Because, when the proper time came, they still refused God's promised life for them. God sent them back into the wilderness for the remainder of their days, about 38 additional years. Only their children, as well as the 2 men who trusted God and were willing to go fight for God, were permitted to enter the Promised Land. Numbers 14 verses 26-34. In the military, if you washed out of basic training for failing to learn how to either use firearms, land navigation, or whatever other essential war skill, you would be sent back to redo the training with the next class, thereby extending your initial training by double. As with the Old Testament Israelites and today's United States military, your wilderness training can be extended. It all depends on how long it takes for you to pass through this season of your life and your willingness to obey. For instance, if God called you to heal the world with wholesome music, to sing and write songs for the kingdom of God, if you still refuse to be courageous and get up on stage and perform when the time came, then how can God use you in this manner, especially if He has prepared you beforehand by having you perform on smaller stages? For my part, singing and writing music is one branch of my calling, which I had intentionally not mentioned earlier in the video series and the book. It is a secondary calling I learned about nearly a year after the initial purpose revelation about orphans and Mormons. I'll elaborate on the secondary calling or purpose later in the series. Because I have, like every new performer, a deadly allergic reaction to fear whenever I'm required to sing in front of people, God started me off small. First, I sang in the small prison worship team during secluded practice sessions. Later, with that same team, I performed in the small prison church congregation, this time playing an instrument while I sang. Over the years since, I have performed my music at the small prison Bible studies as well as in church. Today, at this new prison, I have organized the praise and worship in 4 weekly prison services, and led each congregation with praise songs before each service. What began with 3 or 4 men 6 years ago, I now do with 30 or 40. When I am released, there will be the next level to conquer, and then the next, and then the next, all equally frightening initially, but then I'll move on to the next level of my training until I'm walking fully in what God has been preparing me to do. So far, I have actively participated in whatever God compelled me to do. If I buckle from fear now, however, still so close to the start, how could I ever enter into the promise and perhaps sing in front of hundreds or thousands? If I quit teaching Bible studies and pastoring now when the congregation is merely 30 or so inmates, how would I be able to teach and lead thousands, or even millions if that is in the cards? For the Israelites, it was overcoming their fear of the giants in the Promised Land. For me, it could be as simple as a concert stage or teaching a prison Bible study. On my end, this task will also feel like a gigantic obstacle in need of conquering. Whatever work it is that God has called you to accomplish, you will not fully traverse that life if you don't complete your training. And the only way to complete this training is to daily overcome your natural fear and fully trust in God's plan for your life. He knows you better than you about what you need to learn. He knows your limits and strengths. After all, He did create you. Trust that He can get you from Egypt to the Promised Land and beyond.